Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good morning. Welcome to the Breakout session number 7, which is titled Expanding Our Common Space Through Everyday Multiculturalism. I'm going to be the chair or moderator for this session. Just a few points before we start the presentation to set the context. I think we've heard quite a bit about multiculturalism over the course of the conference. This session in particular is going to bring us into the lived worlds of multicultural diversity. So, just a preamble, the capacity to live with difference, to borrow a phrase from the very eminent Jamaican British sociologist Stuart Hall, and cultural theorist he was, a sociologist, is ever so relevant in the decade of the 21st century, second decade. Especially, we heard quite a lot about kind of divisive politics, the rise of the far right, global conflicts, debates around immigration, integration, as well as the kind of dissonance that social media is creating in the current moment. So for Stuart Hall, he argued that in an increasingly diverse societies, the key challenge is not to eliminate or suppress difference, or for that matter, just manage or superficially celebrate difference. But he calls us to think about how to learn how to live with them in a more productive way, where diversity is engaged with critically, ethically, as well as equitably. And we heard quite a bit of that from the last session. So the capacity to live with difference means living with unresolved tension. So I think that's something we should come to accept, right? That even thinking about the idea of social cohesion and what it means, that that we're not going to have a perfect society where everyone is getting along happily with each other. We will have difference, and difference itself divides us. Why not face up to that reality and think about living with unresolved tension, accepting that democracy is always noisy and plural and contested, and finally, trying to build solidarity without sameness. I think that's perhaps the biggest challenge all of us can take back after this conference, right? That we could work towards building solidarity without sameness, but what that binding glue might be is something we can contemplate. And perhaps we can find answers in the presentation in this session. So, though social divisions, tensions, racism always exist and should be addressed, whether through policies, planning, interventions, I think we should also not overlook the significant strength we have in coping with everyday diversity. And so, in some cases, this very strength that we have built over time, that has evolved over time, by necessity or may well be organically, can give us great insight into building that strength. And this is, I guess, one of the fundamental focus of this concept we call everyday multiculturalism. And what this approach, I would call it, rather than a descriptor, seeks to do, its main focus is one, a concern with how and why. In other words, how, what are the processes, and why, what are the conditions of possibility, as new communities of difference form, or don't form in some cases. Second, identifying the shape and timbre of social relations in situations of lived cultural diversity, such as how tensions and divisions brew and are challenged or worked through, as well as patterns of affinity, solidarity, disjuncture, and divisions in diverse contexts. Third, describing changing patterns of identity and belonging and the nature of new social ties. 4, identifying patterns of contradiction and ambivalence in coexistence, including patterns of hate and racism at the everyday level. And finally, exploring the nature, malleability, inclusiveness, and resilience of new forms of community and diversity in more established urban multicultures, as well as kind of new emerging multicultural societies, and the shifts and reworkings of identities and belonging over time. And this, again, very well illustrated through the case of Singapore. So everyday multiculturalism as a methodological approach can provide us a more nuanced understanding of how ordinary people encounter, negotiate, ignore, or celebrate cultural difference in mundane, informal, often contradictory ways. So to address this big task, we've got two very exciting speakers, a geographer, Professor Susanne Wessendorf, who's a professor of social anthropology at the Center for Peace Security at Coventry University in the UK. She earned her Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, where she was based at the Center on Migration Policy and Society. Her research explores contemporary dynamics of social inclusion and exclusions in context of immigration-related diversity. Obviously, she has published extensively on social relations in super diverse areas and the settlement patterns of recent migrants. In her current work, she examines recent immigration into urban arrival areas, focusing on how newcomers navigate and access support through what she calls arrival infrastructure. Our second speaker is a geographer. This is Professor Katy Bennett, is a professor in human geography at the University of Leicester. Her research advances ways of understanding how people live together in an era of global migration and ethnically complex populations. Her research has made conceptual and methodological advances in understanding the changing geographies of multiculture and how superdiversity is lived and experienced, interfacing social sciences and participatory approaches with psychotherapeutic techniques and opportunities of digitality. She has also led a number of major projects, both in the UK and Europe, most notably a big project on the lived experience of multiculture in new spatial and social relations of diversity, as well as a number of major publications and journal articles. So I'll invite Susanne to the mic, and she's going to present her paper. And just to remind people, if you have questions, I think we will have the QR code on the screen. Please start posting your questions, and we will attend to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raj, for these kind introductions. Thanks for inviting me to this conference. It's a real honor to be here and to talk about some of my recent work. So my presentation explores infrastructures of kindness, and it looks at how social infrastructures facilitate everyday acts of support and inclusion in cities, particularly for migrants. So my talk today mainly focuses on how migrants access resources, for example, information about jobs, housing, or education. But this can be widened more broadly to the general population, and of course it's closely related to enhancing social cohesion. Now, before I start, I want to flag that with the term migrant, I refer to refugees as well as other types of international migrants. So in my research projects, we looked at people with different legal statuses, for example, labor migrants from South Asia or Eastern Europe, as well as refugees. Now, the idea of infrastructures of kindness builds on broader scholarship on social infrastructures and infrastructures of care. And social infrastructures refer to physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact. They include a broad range of spaces like libraries, schools, parks, cafes, hairdressers, and community centers. And social infrastructures play a critical role in enabling social connections, belonging, and support networks. Now, the Greater London Authority differentiates between informal and formal social infrastructures. And with formal social infrastructures, they refer to institutions with a structured role in serving community needs like libraries, schools, community centers, and places of worship. Informal social infrastructures are semi-public or community-driven spaces, for example, cafes or shops, where social support often kind of occurs organically through routine interactions. Now, the Greater London Authority has developed an interesting framework for social integration, and they describe the interplay of different social infrastructures within a local area as an ecosystem where different types of provision form a community of interconnected support. Social infrastructure ecosystems consist of networks and services, some of which are supported by different kinds of buildings, facilities, and organizations. Now, for a local ecosystem to be successful, it is the links between social infrastructures that are important. Signposting between, for example, informal social infrastructures and welfare services can make a really important difference to individuals' access to financial, emotional, and social support. Now, those working in social infrastructures play a really important role in helping people. So what we're interested in my research is in how, within the systemic and personal constraints in which people find themselves, they navigate access to resources like housing, employment, health, legal support, and importantly, social connections. So we're looking at what I've here marked in violet, although actually it's come out gray on the side. We're looking at all these institutions, places, and individuals within all these institutions and places and individuals that are kind of intermediaries, so to say, and might provide support and access to these resources. So while in my research we specifically focused on access to resources, these social infrastructures can be just as important in enhancing social connections and a sense of belonging, and they can therefore play an important role for social cohesion more generally, so not just for newcomers. And I want to turn to some examples from my research now. So I don't want to spend too much time on context, but as a good social scientist, I do want to sort of contextualize where we undertook this work. So the research was based in East London, in the boroughs of Newham and Barking and Dagenham, and both areas have a fairly long history of immigration. They're classical arrival areas where migrants find their feet when they first arrive. And both areas are very deprived, which is why there is still affordable housing available for newcomers, and which is one of the reasons why they are classical arrival areas. So the material I'm using today draws on two research projects. One is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, and the other one by Horizon Europe. And my postdocs, Tamlin Monson and Malte Gembus, undertook most of the research. The research was qualitative and included participant observation in social infrastructures like food banks, community groups, libraries, and English classes. We also undertook interviews with migrants and stakeholders, so for example, people working in migrant support organizations, pastors, Muslim leaders, librarians, and English teachers, and we undertook short surveys with shopkeepers. Now, in the rest of my talk, I describe a variety of different types of support, ranging from simple signposting by shopkeepers to civil society initiatives like food banks to street-level bureaucrats who help individuals. And I'll start with informal social infrastructures. People working in places like shops or cafes talked about how they helped people, often in mundane ways. So, for example, pharmacists told us how they often signposted people to doctors and hospitals. The long-standing proprietor of a newsagent and his colleague told us that they were both keen in helping people out, emphasizing that it is normal to want to help people. It's part of humanity, and describing this as part of our customer relationships. And they described that helping people out is essential for our business. Now, of course, people working in social infrastructures do not just provide help or information to newcomers, but to anyone who approaches them. And in fact, one of the shopkeepers we spoke to explicitly said that, "I don't care if people are migrants, I just try to help." Building on Nigel Thrift's work on urban repair, Hall and Smith talk about minor acts of kindness in which some people are routinely engaged in the context of their working lives. One shopkeeper from Lithuania who speaks Russian said that people come into her shop sometimes just to have a chat in Russian. So it shows that it's not just about concrete help, but it's also about providing social and emotional support and, opportunities to interact. Now, sometimes these acts of kindness go way beyond signposting or just having a chat. So, for example, a restaurant serving food from the Indian region of Kerala has become a hub for information sharing and care. The owner, who is an active member in the local Malayali association, told us that many customers struggle economically due to precarious immigration situations. He said that if someone can't pay, we don't charge them. Now, during COVID, the situation of overseas students from India was particularly concerning because many of them lost their part-time jobs. And as a result, the restaurant owner and the association's leaders set up a food bank. Now, importantly, the food bank offered food for everyone, not just the Indian students. Shopkeepers also told us about helping people with filling in administrative forms or making phone calls for people who struggle with English. Now, I want to emphasize that these everyday acts of kindness in social infrastructures do not replace support provided by local governments, but they can sometimes provide help with accessing formal support like health providers or welfare benefit offices, and they can kind of tide people over during difficult periods. Now, one example of a state-funded social infrastructure in London, which can be crucial in providing support, are libraries. One of the libraries in Newham represents a place which attracts a really large number of individuals from many backgrounds. Now, the library is at library's physical location at the busy high street, and it's set up with its large shop window and posters about community events, and also a continuously busy atmosphere inside the library. All of this signals that it is accessible to people of all different backgrounds. Twice a week, a group of about 15 women gather for their crochet group on a large table by the front window, so it's clearly visible from the street. And during my research, women regularly came into the library to ask members of the group about crochet, and this sometimes led to conversations about how to find other resources. And the crochet group provided a real sense of belonging to many of these women. Now, the library also hosts English classes, and almost all of the students that I spoke to found the class just by walking into the library and asking for information. One of the librarians emphasized that people come in with all kinds of different questions, and she said that the library was there for everybody and for all kinds of inquiries, and she emphasized that the library is like a mother. The Greater London Authority uses the notion of social front doors to refer to spaces that have a distinct presence on the street and that at the entrance convey a welcoming atmosphere, as well as information about services and support. And this library in Newham is a typical example of a successful social front door and a welcoming space where people can enter, ask questions, and spend time. It plays a central role as an infrastructure of kindness in the local area. Now, the library and the shops I talked about mainly provide information about other places of support, but sometimes signposting is not sufficient. And this is particularly the case for people with limited knowledge of the majority language and with few social connections. And these people face manifold barriers. Now, I don't have time to go into these barriers in more detail here, but they include racism, digital exclusion, mental health issues, and caring responsibilities. In our research sites, we found the huge importance of concrete help with someone actually going with newcomers to places where support is provided. So, for example, being accompanied by someone who knows how to navigate the system, fill in forms, access interpreters, or speak to receptionists makes a really big difference. Many of our research participants talked about the importance of hand-holding, and we found that different types of people provided such help. So they ranged from friends and relatives, of course, to individuals working in civil society organizations and places of worship. Importantly, we also found that individuals working in state institutions like libraries or schools played an important role, and some went way beyond their remit to help people. And these individuals have also been conceptualized as street-level bureaucrats. So, for example, teachers told us that they sometimes helped new families access services such as welfare support or language classes, or they supported them with job applications. And importantly, this work was usually done outside of normal working hours and was not part of their job description. However, the local authority in the borough of Newham has tried to enhance and institutionalize infrastructures of kindness. They have acknowledged the necessity of direct hands-on support that newcomers need, especially asylum seekers. And they now conduct weekly visits to asylum seeker accommodations to facilitate immediate access to essential services. Now, this formalization of hand-holding could also be understood as the institutionalization of infrastructures of kindness, where practices of care and social support become embedded within bureaucratic mechanisms. Now, by systematically organizing direct outreach and welfare provision to those in need, the local authority transforms discretionary acts of kindness into structured forms of hand-holding that bridge gaps in access and inclusion. Now, to end, I just want to think a little bit about the potential policy implications of these findings regarding social cohesion, urban planning, and governance. Informal social infrastructures, such as local businesses, play an important role in fostering everyday inclusion and social cohesion. Commercial spaces like shops, takeaways, and barbershops can serve vital functions beyond their economic role. Now, these places often act as informal meeting points, especially for those who may not participate in more formal community settings. For some, especially isolated and marginalized residents, they are important places of casual contact and can be crucial to their well-being and social inclusion, and as I have shown, for accessing resources. Rather than viewing formal and informal social infrastructures separately, local authorities could facilitate linkages between public services and informal social infrastructures. So, for example, councils could provide support to local businesses to serve as information hubs for newly arrived migrants or other more marginalized groups. Community organizations could also be partnered with small businesses to distribute multilingual information on healthcare or housing assistance, ensuring that key resources reach those in need. And the example of the library shows how investment in public spaces can enhance urban social cohesion by providing accessible places for interaction and resource access. And by incorporating these insights into urban social cohesion policies, local governments can create more inclusive cities where infrastructures of kindness are recognized, supported, and sustained. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanne. That was really a fascinating talk, particularly the way you have brought the informal and formal infrastructures into dialogue, and how that can facilitate both an important resource for many migrants into new cities and so forth. To continue the conversation, I'll invite Katy Bennett to present her paper. Thanks.
Cheers. Hi, everyone. It's day 3, and we're still going strong. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see everybody here. I'd like to say a special thanks to the organisers who've looked after us so well through the week. It's been absolutely amazing being here. Thank you. So, my name's Katy Bennett, and I'm from the University of Leicester. And in this presentation, I'll be reflecting on how super diverse societies live together in the UK. And I'm going to be connecting with some of the issues that have been brought up over the last couple of days, especially around our digital worlds. And I might also be mentioning K-pop, Korean pop music. That also cropped up in my research, and people were talking about that yesterday. There are 2 key takeaway messages that I want to leave you with. And this is my first one is a little bit different to the way in which things have been going in the conference so far, because my first point is that in the UK, we need to move beyond a politics of integration, which demands newcomers and minority groups to fit in. So in this presentation, I'll be exploring how people live together in a city that is described as segregated, and how this research aligns with a new and emerging policy agenda, which I'm really interested in, that's concerned with the idea of convivial disintegration. So I'll be coming back into that towards the end of my presentation. The second thing I want to do is I want to push research on everyday multiculturalism in new directions by tuning into ideas of mobilities, people's mobilities, not rootedness and belonging, but how we live our lives on the move, even if it's just kind of moving around on a daily routine basis, as well as kind of moving between cities, between countries, across borders. So I'll be focusing on our mobilities. I'll also be using social media data to understand how people live and experience place together. And my reason for focusing on social media data is to kind of broaden the lens. A lot of our research on everyday multiculturalism is very much through the lens of the ethnographer, the researcher, which can be limited, which can have blind spots. So we've been looking at ways of kind of expanding, to involve kind of more viewpoints, tapping into the kind of social media data that's been available to us. So I live in the UK, a country currently struggling with its multicultural values. After the 2005 London bombings, the UK began to reevaluate policies that supported ethnic and religious diversity. Since then, politicians have talked about the failure of multiculturalism, leading in the UK to integrationist policies such as language requirements and citizenship tests. And citizenship tests, or the Life in Britain test, is interesting. And it's something that I do with my students on our 3rd year module. We sit and take it together, and we invariably fail. we failed to take the citizen, we failed, we wouldn't pass, we wouldn't become British citizens because we can't answer the questions. And the questions are often very tied into British history, English history, knowing your kings and queens, knowing what happened in World War II, really kind of intricate information that's kind of tuned into this kind of expectation of what it is to be British, what it means to be British. And lots of us in that classroom kind of struggle with those kind of understandings, that kind of discourse that comes through the citizenship test. So we invariably fail. My home city is Leicester in the English Midlands. One of the first UK cities with no ethnic majority. It's often described as super diverse. It's a place often referenced in critiques of multiculturalism. Suella Braverman, a British politician, spoke in Washington, D.C. to the American Enterprise Institute about 18 months ago. And she was arguing that multiculturalism as a policy agenda had failed, with ethnic and cultural groups living parallel lives. And she emphasized the need for integration. And yet again, Leicester often kind of appears in speeches as an example of a place that's failed, as a good example of why we need to kind of shift our policy agendas. Maps of Leicester seem to support this view, this failure, showing distinct ethnic concentrations, shaped by colonial legacies and migration to the UK from its former colonies. Two really broad ethnic groups predominate in Leicester and are strongly associated with different parts of the city. So white British people are strongly associated with wards to the east of the city, and British Asian people with wards in the east of the city. So at first glance, Leicester appears segregated. Yet I'm also haunted by the words of a school pupil, Sabita, a participant in one of our research projects concerned with how people live together in multicultural places. Talking about Leicester, she said, although the city may be diverse, it's also segregated, but the segregation doesn't divide us. Like, obviously we're not integrated, we live like parallel lives. And it's that comment that's really intrigued me, and I've been kind of focusing on, and it's been haunting me ever since. This idea that the segregation doesn't divide us. So Sabita acknowledges the segregation, but she also invites us to look more closely at what is happening on the ground. Her words are important because maps like this that I've just shown you identify ethnic groups very broadly. Those maps appeared a lot after the recent census in 2021. And they're very broad. They take a kind of a real broad view. They kind of put us into these two very large ethnic groups, kind of ignoring all the diversity within those groups. But they've also been used, those maps have been used to fuel this shift away from multiculturalism towards integrationist agendas. So these maps show where people sleep on census night once every 10 years. They miss how people move around, going to school, going to work, to socialize. Research on multiculturalism, everyday multiculturalism, and that's kind of how it's routinely lived, not the kind of the big policy kind of conceptualization of multiculturalism. As Raj was kind of explaining at the start, that tries to capture how people routinely rub along together in shared public or semi-public spaces through observation and interviews. But it often focuses on a place, not on how people move through places. So we focused our research on young people's mobilities and how these shape experiences of Leicester using the virtual reality environment of Google Earth in our interviews. And you can see what this looks like in the photograph here. Although we were speaking to students in schools, they had kind of Oculus Rift headsets, they were in Google Earth, they were experiencing Google Earth in 3D, and we could see what they were looking at in 2D on the screens behind them. And they took us around the city, walked us around the city. But interestingly, they also took us beyond the city. They took us to places they'd lived before, to London, places where they might have grown up, to places where they might have been born or where their grandparents lived. So we got a real sense of their kind of their lives on the move. Not only how they moved around the city on a day-to-day basis, but how they moved around in other parts of their life. Also, during our interviews with young people, we found ourselves visiting a lot of chicken shops, independent chicken shops, and also kind of chain chicken restaurants like Nando's, which is a really popular restaurant in the UK. I'm not sure if you have Nando's in Singapore. Do you have Nando's in Singapore? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. So these were places where young people in our research from across the city felt comfortable meeting up. They didn't like meeting up in each other's homes because, they're embarrassed about showing their kind of different cultures and taking people home, and that wasn't a place where they wanted to spend time. They wanted to spend time in kind of chicken shops and these kind of public, semi-public spaces where they could hang out freely. They felt kind of comfortable in these places. And they're very different to our kind of traditional British pubs. Chicken shops are popular places for young people because they're alcohol-free, and a lot of our students, because of religious beliefs, don't drink alcohol. They eat chicken, there's vegetarian options, they're affordable, and they're inclusive. They're what geographers call third spaces, not home, first space, not work, second space. They're third spaces. They're semi-public, they're socially neutral, and they're supportive of informal interaction. And I'm going to take you into a chicken shop now to kind of have a look at what's going on. It's a chicken shop actually in London. This film's produced by a really interesting kind of community group there. But it's very similar. It's very, very similar to chicken shops in Leicester. And I really like this little video. So it's a 2-minute clip. And I want us to kind of let's think about what makes these spaces work for young people as places to hang out. I want you to kind of observe the space, be a geographer, look at how the space is organized, look at how people are kind of interacting and using that space, what they're saying about this space.
PFC has its own culture, it's got its own language as well. So for some reason, there's this unwritten rule where you prefer to, whoever's serving you, bossman, and he refers back to you as bossman, and everyone's there as bossman.
Bossman means what? I can't put it into words. Using the term bossman is a form of respect.
Yeah. When it's someone we know or like someone from the same background, we'll be like baisab, or like, which means brother, just out of respect.
Oh, bossman. I want some wings. I want some chips. Oh, can I get how many wings for £1? You'd see some people trying to cut a deal with the owner. They would go up to the owner and they'd be like, "Oh, boss man, I want to swap a drink with another 2 more wings. Is that possible?" And so PFC kind of turned into a vocabulary of its own.
It's more than just a chicken shop because it's like some people's second home.
Yeah, we're brought up with it.
Yeah, and it's like a social gathering.
Yeah, the venue will be the Englishman's pub.
Yeah.
PFC is a very warm place where you can hang out with your mates. It's safe, especially in the winter time when it gets dark very early and it starts to rain and it's very cold. And you can stay there as long as you want and you won't get kicked out.
Whereas at KFC, it's very, very dead, very, very soul-sucking. You just go there, you just get your chicken and you just leave. Whereas at PFC, I feel like I'm part of a society.
They try and really give you that personal experience, which is not something you'd expect for someone who's trying to feed you a lunch or dinner. So I think people do find that experience quite attractive.
It's like a friendly kind of atmosphere, It's like you're local, everyone there. They talk to you, ask about your family. Everyone knows generally about yourself and all that,
Very rarely you get individuals who go to PFC shops by themselves. It's usually with 2 members at least. Everyone knows that, it's bad for you, it impacts you, but, just for the whole social sake, for your peers, you just end up going. And I've been an example of that as well.
So the chicken shops are kind of an important space to hang out, and they're particularly important in Leicester because right now in Leicester, we're struggling with our kind of authority finances, and our libraries are going through a process of choosing which ones to close and reduce their opening hours. Youth centres have been, many of them have been closed, and so our public spaces are being restricted. So a lot of my fight is kind of making the argument for keeping our kind of public spaces open, but also kind of looking at these kind of semi-public spaces that are kind of relatively neutral ground. So if we're thinking about what makes these spaces important and significant, they're neutral ground. They're not tied to any one group, are they? They're kind of familiar. They have kind of routine-orientated environments. They're kind of, people use them kind of, once a week at least, often kind of more than that, kind of, and they know what to expect when they go there. They're really affordable. People talk about kind of the cheap price of chicken. They're accessible. And they offer space to kind of dwell, to hang out. People don't get kind of moved on very quickly, unlike in places like McDonald's, maybe. They involve a social mix of people without any pressure to interact. People are together, but not necessarily interacting. The food, the idea of chicken, no alcohol, it doesn't carry any cultural baggage. There's the bossman, who's the convivial kind of instigator, keeping an eye on things, keeping people safe. People feel safe. Bossman's a term of affection and respect, and is the person kind of running the shop. And there's lots of small talk and joking and banter, but also what we call civil inattention. People are aware of what's going on. People are aware of other people brushing past tables, but also minding their own business, not particularly getting involved. So this is what research on everyday multiculturalism does. It explores how we routinely share space and coexist as part of our daily lives. But scholars like Junjie Yi have also asked, who is the we so concerned with how we live together in these studies? Who conducts the research? And who is it for? And I think she's asking a really important question, especially when you look at somebody like me, who's white, middle-class woman. I'm doing the research, I'm doing the interviewing, I'm observing these spaces. There's blind spots, and I'm missing a lot. I haven't experienced racism or racialization and the harms of those. So this question from Junjie Yi prompted us to look at ways of stepping back in our research and letting participants lead. So we experimented with social media, specifically using Twitter data. And we downloaded 1 million geotagged tweets, which were connected with 2018-2019. And noticed that yet again, chicken shops and Nando's came up often. Social media gave us insights that traditional interviews sometimes obscure. People often perform in interviews, telling you what they think you want to hear. But on Twitter, we caught more spontaneous expressions. Broadly, you can see that our Twitter findings supported what our young people told us. Nando's was often described as a second home, a place of comfort and belonging. But social media, when we kind of got into the tail end, especially the negative, also revealed tensions. The idea of civil inattention, minding your own business in shared space, was kind of blasted out of the water in some respects, was disrupted. We saw uncivil attention, moments where people were posting kind of quite nasty things, where they were kind of being judgy, judgmental, and kind of hostile. And you can see a couple of examples there a bit. Anyone who holds chicken like that can't be trusted, and there's lots that we're exploring in that. So this left us with two questions. How do online digital worlds shape our experience of physical spaces? Are we truly understanding people's lives if we only focus on what's visible in public space? And this connects to some of our discussion yesterday. We need to consider more than real worlds. Even as you listen now, you might be checking your phone. I can see a few of you doing that. How do the images and messages that you're receiving here in this room that you're connecting with, how do they shape your experience of this space and this time? As you're looking at those pictures and those messages of what's going on at home or somewhere else in your life, how does that affect how you're experiencing this room? And that's what interests us. So let's return to Sabita. She said Leicester might be described as segregated, but the city doesn't divide us. There's wisdom here. Much research on multiculturalism focuses on specific cities or neighborhoods. But what about people's journeys through life, their experiences of mobility, routine and moving around the world as they migrate to cities like Leicester? There are simultaneous connections with here and there through their digital worlds. Research on everyday multiculturalism is typically concerned with kind of the where everyday multiculturalism happens. But what about the wherewithal of people? What do they learn on their journey through life, and how does this shape how they live with people? So the wherewithal of people connects with thinking geographically how they become wiser as they move around, and how places are lived and experienced on the move. This gets over that idea of kind of belonging and rootedness. We're thinking about, people, everybody living their lives on the move, and how place is experienced. Place is almost generated through that mobility. So wherewithal is a term that involves a worldliness beyond the local, requiring us to stretch our methods beyond the field of our fieldwork. And this requires us to expand our place-bound research to involve people's mobilities and digital worlds. It also involves attending to immobilities and feelings of stuckness and not being able to move on, that kind of other side of the coin of mobilities, when people want to move on but can't for a lot of different reasons. In our study, half the participants had moved to Leicester from elsewhere, which reflects the city more generally. And the young people embodied a worldliness that we experienced in our interviews as they returned to a bus stop in London, where they'd previously lived, or stood outside a school or grandparents' home in another country. And we really felt they would go silent at those times, when we just felt the emotion, felt the affect of that experience of kind of being by their side as they were stood outside their grandparents' home in another part of the world. Others had grandparents who'd migrated to Leicester, their moving, sometimes traumatic stories reverberating through family generations, also shaping the wherewithal of our participants. So they might not have moved to Leicester from somewhere else, but listening to their stories of their parents and their grandparents, deeply affected them and have shaped our interviews. Sometimes mobility itself felt like a space of belonging, and participants showed us how this was lived through interests such as Korean pop music, K-pop, that they drew upon to connect with people, to feel comfortable and create a sense of home on the move. So their online worlds, their kind of interesting kind of K-pop, they kind of used from one place to the next. And one of our participants was kind of really used it very kind of artfully to kind of get along with people in a life that was really lived on the move. And this mobility shaped their experience of fragmented togetherness at school. Some took a social butterfly approach, moving and flitting between groups, while others remained cautious. But this kind of wherewithal, this kind of worldly experience, shaped how they were in new spaces and new sites. And both strategies, both these examples, made sense within a fluid, fragmented social world. The UK's integrationist agenda treats maps as truth. It sees ethnic concentrations as a problem, doesn't realise the diversity within groups, and imagines a vague endpoint of integration, one that's rarely defined but seems steeped in that nostalgic narrow thinking of what it means to be British. But what if we focused on convivial disintegration? Involved the entire population, didn't just focus on kind of burdening newcomers to the city with ideas of assimilation and integration. We don't ever imagine an end point of integration. We're always endlessly kind of trying to live together on the move. It recognises that lives are lived on the move, even though immigration legislation and social cohesion agendas suggest otherwise. So these debates that are shifting towards convivial disintegration are an alternative to integrationist agendas, emphasizing fragmentation, mobilities, superdiversity, temporality, no endpoint of integration, and the unburdening of minority, ethnic, racialized groups from expectations to assimilate, whilst more powerful groups watch on. Sabita reminded us that segregation doesn't mean division. Leicester may appear segregated, but it isn't necessarily divided. It may be a model of convivial disintegration, a way of living fragmentedly but meaningfully. Our research attempts to explore how this fragmented togetherness is lived and experienced. At the same time, if politicians in the UK keep chasing integration as an endpoint, they'll miss what's already happening on the ground. Convivial disintegration invites us to invest not in assimilation, but in spaces and resources, those libraries, those community centres that support fragmented togetherness on its own terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Katy. Again, very fascinating talk and the research you're doing. I can see some common points between the two papers, that of the emphasis of space and placemaking, as well as the nexus of mobility in the case of migrants to a new city, as well as people on the move in where they are living, and the kind of connections that they make in those contexts. We've got some questions coming in, so feel free if you have questions to post them on Pigeonhole. I'll just start first with a question for Susanne. You talked a lot about this turn to looking at infrastructure from a social lens. Why do you think this recent shift has happened, and I mean, why focus on the social component of infrastructure?
Thanks, Raj. So I think this is related to, it's quite context specific to Britain and maybe Europe more generally, and it's related to the backlash against multiculturalism that started happening in the 2000s with terrorist attacks in London and riots in the north of England. And the government increasingly blaming multiculturalism for enhancing so-called parallel lives. And we saw that this discourse is still happening on your slide with Priti Patel talking about parallel lives. So there was kind of an emphasis of the local and looking at neighborhoods and local spaces and social cohesion rather than multiculturalism. And as part of this focus on the local, policymakers now increasingly sort of look at the role of the built environment and its influence on human relationships on the ground. And part of this built environment are, of course, social infrastructures and the kinds of relationships that happen within them.
Good, thank you. A question for you, Katy. You talked about this kind of worldly wisdom that may well be the kind of the solution to living parallel lives or living segregated lives. Can you, how does that concept actually change our understanding of how people navigate multicultural cities?
Yeah. It gets beyond this whole idea of some people belonging, some people having roots. It focuses attention much more on how we live everybody lives their lives on the move, and it focuses attention much more on that. The other thing that it's trying to do is to get away from that nasty question, like, where are you from? And it's the where, what do you carry with you? What's the wherewith that you carry with you? What does your life on the move, moving around places and cities, across borders, how does that shape you and your experiences and your approaches to life? So it's kind of also kind of encouraging that shift. And the third thing that I kind of got really interested in was, and I find really hard to articulate, and there's not words for it because people weren't able to kind of articulate it, but we certainly felt it in our interviews where people would be stood outside in a virtual reality environment. They'd find a special home, a grandparent's home or a relative's home or somewhere they'd previously lived or gone to school. And you'd kind of soak up that kind of feeling, that effect, and that was, shaping them and shaping their experiences, that they were also trying to articulate about how they were kind of living their lives in the cities where we were doing the research, in Leicester, for example. And it felt significant. We were unable to kind of research that and kind of fully understand that because it's so hard to kind of articulate, to put words to. But we're trying to kind of work empathetically and kind of bridging kind of psychotherapeutic techniques with social sciences to try and kind of gauge that a bit more. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Susanne.
I find it really interesting that the importance of social media and for these young people, and it's also been a big element of this conference throughout. And in my work, it's been sort of on the margins, or it's not been on the margins, but we haven't looked at it so specifically because one of the big factors of exclusion of marginalized communities, like new migrants, is digital exclusion and digital illiteracy. And that is why these social infrastructures are so important. They're important for those people who don't know how to access the internet or who don't speak English and can't find the right resources online. So it's a really interesting opposition.
Yeah.
So I've got a question from the floor, which I think we haven't quite touched on, which is we talked about class and ethnicity, religion, but the gender dimension in both of your work, particularly with the question was on the chicken shop video, which only featured boys. And probably in your work, this is fairly, most likely women are accessing those formal, informal rival infrastructures. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the chicken shops, it's a longer film, and I think I just happened to use the 2-minute clip where it was just kind of boys involved, but in the much broader short film, there were more female voices, far more for female voices, mothers talking to the camera about, taking their children there after school, and women talking about it. So chicken shops are definitely a place where boys and girls go, men and women go, and definitely that's the case in Leicester, and you see it in the Twitter data, who's posting, the gender of the Twitter data, and we also kind of experienced it in our interviews. It was across the board. It was kind of men and women, boys and girls that were talking about the importance of, and just loving going to kind of chicken shops in their spare time.
Excellent question. Of course, there's very much a gender dimension relating to social infrastructures. And it was interesting. So, for example, in the library, the crochet group was, of course, dominated by women, or not just dominated, it was only women. But there was another corner in the library where every time I was there, and I was there twice a week for quite a while, there was a group of elderly men hanging out together. So it was a space for everybody. But of course, then you also have the generational differences. So you mainly had people who were not working, so elderly men, mothers during school hours, and elderly women. But there were other spaces. So for example, when I asked a group of English learners in an English class, and they were mainly from of Bangladeshi origin, when I'm asked about where they get information, when they need any information about things, state-related, health-related things. The men said they'd go to the mosque, and the women said, no, we don't go to the mosque, we ask at school. So there were different places where they would seek help. And of course, the school gates are an important way, where you drop off your children. They're an important place of social interaction for women. And then there's the more informal social infrastructures like barbers, which are very either for men or for women, but I think they played an important role for everyone.
Another question from the floor. It is, part of fostering cohesive society through the built environment is bringing alongside the key decision makers to the project team. Could you share some challenges and successes, case studies navigating this situation?
The digital element of the research. There's so many challenges. So there's lots of opportunities. I think I was talking about those in the talk, but there's lots of challenges. So when we were using Twitter data, I work with computer scientists, so I work with a team of people. We were doing algorithmic sentiment analysis, but things move at such a fast pace. We're using large language models to try and capture the mood of different parts of the city, to be kind of quite dynamic around that. Twitter data we found at that time in 2018, 2019, easily accessible. You could relatively easily access it at no expense. Now, since it's been bought out by Elon Musk, and it's now X, it costs a lot more to use, so that's a challenge. And also, there's a lot of research ethics. In our project, we had to go through an extensive research ethics review, because people might be posting their data information things publicly, but they don't necessarily expect researchers to be kind of using this data for their research. So we had to engage in a lot of conversations to kind of justify and explain our research to get ethical approval to do it. That side of it is really, really tricky. And then there's lots of different, various kind of social media platforms that you can use. And there's some like Snapchat, which is potentially really useful to researchers, but those messages disappear, and you can't use social media platforms like that. So I find it a really fascinating area, but I'm not sure about where I'm going to go in the future, what we're going to be doing in the future. I've been kind of really kind of enlivened to it, the opportunities of it, the kind of worlds it exposes us to, but it is limited. The other thing to mention as well, so Leicester has a population of about 360,000, so it's kind of a small city, but the total number of Twitter users who are tweeting about Leicester or geotagging Leicester was 30,000. So in relation to the kind of earlier question, it's limited to those with access to Twitter, so we could only involve 30,000 people in our research. So that's another limitation. And who's doing it? It's probably middle-class people, access to the facilities, social media platforms, with time to do it. A lot of us don't have time to tweet about our lives. So there's all those kinds of considerations and challenges that need to be thought through.
So I think the question was about bringing decision makers to the table, right? And that is indeed a challenge to make our research impactful and go beyond academia. What we did in this project is we organized a workshop at the beginning of the project, bringing together people from the local authorities, or policymakers, and civil society stakeholders, and bring them into a room. And our intention was to present our ideas of the research, but also pick their brains of what their issues are and what kinds of things they would like us to do the research on. But then it turned out that actually for them it was a really a great event, because they wanted to connect with each other, and they all emphasized how rarely they have the opportunity to step back from their work and connect with each other and talk about shared challenges and ways forward. So that was great. And at the end of our project, we invited them again and told them about our results. And one of the wonderful things that came out of our work on our emphasis on migrant arrival and social infrastructure was that the local authority then set up a project called Welcome Newham, where they created a drop-in center at a local library where people could go and ask for information. And out of that, they realized how important the hand-holding was, and they then institutionalized the support for asylum seekers by going to the asylum seeker housing and reaching out to people in need and going where the people are as one of the main policy initiatives. So that was quite a nice outcome of the project.
Cool. Thank you. Another question from the floor. Why is it, do you think, that we are so focused on structure or place than behaviors? In particular, can parallel life be also about behavior rather than actual practice? Yeah. Do we need to be more nuanced?
I think, yes. So I've been focusing very much on place and showing maps and how it appears, how it gets represented. But I think it does have quite a bit to do with behaviour as well. The other thing that's going on in Leicester, which is quite interesting, is we've always had, we've had a lot of secular schools, so people kind of from all religions going to those state kind of secular schools. We've also always in Leicester had a Church of England school, Catholic schools, but we're also now experiencing kind of more religious schools, growing number of religious schools. And where those schools are locating, kind of people are moving to. So our neighborhoods are, this kind of comes down to kind of behavior, I guess. People are kind of coming together in these neighborhoods around these schools. And it has a lot to do with kind of broader, what's going on more broadly in relation to kind of the tightening of immigration legislation in the UK. So borders, in many ways, are kind of not just at the point of crossing in the UK, but they're in our lives every day. If you want to if you want to open a new bank account, or if you want to get a house, you have to have identity documents, and it's deliberately, it was designed to create a hostile environment for illegal immigration, and I think it's our hate crimes are going up in Leicester and in the UK on the back of this hostile environment. So I think people are, it's changing behaviour, and people are kind of sticking together for safety and security because racialisation and racism is on the rise. So, for example, if I went into a letting agency and wanted to rent a house and I'd forgotten to take my identity documents, somebody would probably say, "Oh, she's obviously British, just let her go." But if somebody else walked into that space and wanted to rent a house, and they weren't white British, and they didn't have their identity documents, they would absolutely be, asked for those documents. So, kind of everyday people are being put in a position of being kind of unofficial border guards, if you like, which is affecting the atmosphere of cities in the UK, I think, and it is changing behaviour. Some research is showing how the country is desegregating. Between 2001 and 2011, you could see neighbourhoods diversifying, but that really slowed down between 2011 and 2021. The process of diversification within neighbourhoods has really, really slowed down, and I think that's on the back of this kind of increasingly hostile environment that politicians have created on the back of this kind of tightening immigration legislation, and that's affecting behaviour. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for this interesting question, Mike. It's really important. Well, I think it's behavior happens in place, right? So that is where it is in places where we can observe behavior and participate, so we can do our classical ethnographic participant observation as researchers. So what do people do in these places? How do they interact with each other? It is in places where we can observe this. And maybe just for some examples, in my earlier work on superdiversity and social relations in a superdiverse area in East London, for example, I also attended a crochet group. I've become pretty good with my crocheting in the course of my research. And there was elderly women of all different ethnic and national backgrounds attending the group and interacting with each other and having fun and seeing each other every week, and it was all very convivial and positive. But what I noticed after a while was that when they left the group to go home, they split into language groups. So the Nigerian women would go home together and speak in their language, and the Indian women would go together. So I realized, okay, so they come together in the group, but then they go home separately. I also spent a lot of time in a shopping mall observing who people shopped with, and it was generally people of the same background, because who do you go shopping with? You shop with your friends, with your best friends usually, or with your family. So what I realized is that there's this interesting differentiation between different types of spaces developed by Lynn Loughlin, a sociologist in the US, and she talks about public, parochial, and private space. Now, we're familiar with public and private spaces, but parochial spaces are those semi-public spaces where people come together. So they can be playgrounds in a park, or the kinds of social infrastructures I talked about earlier. And what I observed in my research is that there's a lot of interactions across various types of differences, class, ethnic, gender, etc., in parochial spaces in East London, but less so in private space. But actually, it's not an issue. As long as you have these positive interactions in parochial spaces, you do have a sort of mutual understanding about each other and mutual respect. And I think that is what is really crucial for social cohesion.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a related question here, which speaks to this point about not being overly concerned or driven by the idea of integration and social cohesion, but as an endpoint, which Katy mentioned. But that also raises problems, right? How do we then build social fabric, for instance, or sense of belonging? And maybe, Susanne, you have partly answered that there are spaces and opportunities for that to happen always. Is that right? And likewise, Katy.
Yeah, I mean, it makes kind of public space incredibly important. It's about not closing down your public spaces. Libraries, Susanne was talking, libraries are so much more than places where you kind of get books. They're kind of warm places. They're places where clubs meet, knitting circles, all sorts. People kind of go. And to support this idea of convivial disintegration, we need to kind of be keeping those kind of spaces, those public spaces, available and freely accessible and open to people, not closing them down, not closing down the kind of the opening hours. I do think we need to, in a city like Leicester, kind of revisit our idea of faith schools. And I do see kind of faith schools that kind of polarizing and segregating kind of communities from each other. So convivial disintegration. I mean, school provides an amazing opportunity for people to mix. And I've been hearing all about this in relation to kind of the Singaporean examples, and I feel the opposite's happening in the UK, and especially in a city like Leicester. I've been involved in loads of research projects. I had a researcher who was doing a secondment with Leicester City Council, and she was working with kind of young people kind of as part of that. And young people were quite frustrated about limited opportunities to talk about their experiences of living in the UK, of living in cities, in Leicester. And conversations around kind of racism, racialization getting closed down, and schools not being comfortable by that. And I think schools need to kind of open up their agenda beyond kind of celebrating kind of diversity days and things like that, to kind of creating spaces where there's much more opportunity to kind of open and up and talk freely about experiences, rather than kind of closing down and just celebrating people's heritage on these kind of diversity days. And this shift away from kind of integrationist and even multiculturalism is towards kind of convivial disintegration, just kind of recognizes the diversity of diversity, the super diversity, which none of these kind of politics of integration really recognize adequately, I don't think. So that's why I'm really drawn to this idea of convivial disintegration. It's about working with the grain, working with what's going on on the ground. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, very good question again, and I'm glad you mentioned schools, because I was also going to mention those, and Mr. Ho this morning made a really good point about state schools here in Singapore and the insistence on mixed schools, and I think that is a problem that we have in the UK, that we have both faith schools as well as private schools, and I think schools are that place of mixing for young people, and it's so crucial for them to meet each other. So I think it's also kind of about who is left out of the social glue, who does not have opportunities to use these spaces. Sometimes these are migrant workers who just simply don't have time and don't speak the language, but maybe also aren't given the information about where they could learn the majority language. Maybe they're also housed, or for example, asylum seekers in the United Kingdom are sometimes housed in quite segregated spaces outside of towns, in hotels, where they just don't get enough opportunities to interact. And I think tensions between these groups, or prejudice against these groups, such as asylum seekers or migrant workers, can also rise because there just isn't enough opportunity for the majority population to interact with these groups.
Another question, back to this idea of space creation. If we are living in societies which sort of symbolizes a fragmented togetherness, and that spaces may be one of the solutions that can bring us together. How do we create such spaces? I mean, Susanne, you talked about informal, organically emerging spaces, whether it's the hair salon or the cafe or and so forth, and then you've got libraries and schools. Are there more that we can do?
Shall I start? I think you've touched on some of this as well. I mean, youth centres, youth clubs, sports clubs, the libraries. I think there's a lot we can do to create these spaces and to encourage people to come to these spaces. You can also provide micro-grants for civil society organizations, or just generally funding for organizations that enhance these spaces of interactions, or organize plant swaps between local residents, street parties. There's a good initiative in Newham where they organize citizens' dinners, where people come together to cook. They also have an initiative called Interfaith Week, where faith organizations, mosques and temples and churches open their doors, and you can go visit these different faith places, also with schools. Various initiatives for interfaith dialogue, although I want to say that sometimes then secular people are left out of these spaces. So I think it's important when we talk about interfaith spaces to also include those who aren't of a particular faith. So I think there's various initiatives that can be supported with public funding. So I think it's really important to provide the financial means to enhance these spaces.
And in Leicester, it seems to be going the other way.
Yes, well, I mean, our public spaces with the austerity and the cuts to kind of council funding, Leicester's quite a deprived city, so it doesn't have a lot of money, and it's trying to work out what to kind of cut and what to keep, and libraries seems to be something that the kind of local politicians think might be a way of the way forward, but it would be incredibly damaging to a city like Leicester that's incredibly diverse and needs these spaces to kind of go to hang out, to interact, to be with people. I agree with everything that Susanne said, but maybe just a little kind of extra add-on. Actually, the young people also kind of find ways of making spaces and creating spaces and using spaces differently and unexpectedly, and perhaps not always in the way intended, and I've certainly seen that in our research in cities in the UK. But also in addition, the chicken shop showed kind of the role of kind of private businesses as well, as in terms of kind of opening up and creating kind of an affordable, relatively affordable, you still need money to go there, but kind of accessible and warm, and they don't. What the young people were talking about in relation to their experiences of chicken shops in Leicester in interviews was that they never get chucked out. They're never told to leave. They can literally just buy a Coke and a pack of chips or something, and they can stay there as long as they want. So I think the role of kind of businesses in creating this space for convivial disintegration to kind of work its way out shouldn't be overlooked as well.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Another question around, what are the sort of main values that drive everyday multiculturalism for the people in formal and informal infrastructures? Is it just getting by, or accessing social capital, social network, finding opportunities for job, housing, or is it just hang out and be friend? It's part of the friendship circle. Are there more that your participants were looking for? To perhaps to be part of this new city, the new place they've come to.
I can take that. Make a start with that. I think it's both. It depends on your social position in the society and where you're at in your life. So I talked about my earlier research in East London about superdiversity and social relations, and I hung out in all these different kinds of community spaces for quite a long time and realized that actually there weren't many newcomers, people who had arrived within the last 5 years or so, spending time in these spaces. And that's of course because they're too busy building their lives. They're working very hard, or they don't know about these spaces. So these spaces were more like people who spent time in these spaces were more people who wanted to create social connections and to form, I wouldn't even call it social capital because it wasn't about achieving something, it was just about being together and forming friendships. But the social infrastructures I talked about earlier, the shops, but also the library, were spaces where you can go and get information, and that applies to more recent newcomers who still haven't found their way into society and need specific things. And I think once you have settled more and you're more secure in your socioeconomic position, you then start going to the football club or going to the crochet group, etc.
Education's a really interesting thing in the UK because most children go to school, do primary education and kind of secondary education up to the age of 16, quite locally. So they kind of go to school near their kind of neighbourhoods. They're with friends who are probably kind of like in a city that's kind of quite segregated ethnically and culturally, like Leicester. They're kind of mixing with their own. It's not until they kind of go into post-16 education that they're travelling across the city for education. And they're thrown into a whole new different experience. And this is in cities across the UK. So I've observed it in Milton Keynes and in Hackney. And often, in canteens, you see people kind of, there's a real division. There's kind of people kind of hanging out with people who they might have commuted into college with. There is often reluctance to kind of mix. People aren't often kind of confident enough to mix. But then when you look between what's happening between tables, where groups are eating together and socializing and kind of met up, with their own, you start to see people just kind of moving between the groups. And these are often quite confident characters, but they start linking tables and people start interacting. And there's lots of opportunities for bumping and meeting people and meeting new faces as people are getting their food. So that there is a kind of a confidence that comes with it. And you see some people are kind of more at ease with kind of mixing than others. But schools are an interesting environment for that, in relation to that kind of question, I think.
Yeah.
Post-16 education in particular.
Thank you. Sorry to put you both on the spot, since we've talked quite a lot about the UK and the cities in the UK. For the benefit of a local audience, given the few days you've been here, can you reflect on the situation here?
So this is my first time to Singapore. I've never been to this amazing country. I've absolutely loved it. And I have spent an awful lot of time in this room. So I'm having a weekend here, so I'm spending some extra time here. I'm going to be able to properly explore it. But from what I've heard from conversations, there's a really interesting kind of social cohesion agenda. I find it I don't feel able to answer that question very well at the moment because I just don't know Singapore well enough.
Mm-hmm. Katy?
So, what I've seen has been very much shaped by where you have taken me. Thank you very much. I have to say I'm really impressed by the creation of these communal spaces in what is the housing called?
HDB.
HDB, on the ground floor, sometimes the 2 bottom floors, and the opportunities for people to interact in these spaces and this emphasis on, public spaces that are accessible for everyone. I find that really impressive, and also, you know, there seems to be quite a lot of social engineering in terms of people bringing people together. Whether that always works, I cannot say after a few days of being here. But I think what I said about parochial spaces, the importance of these spaces where people actually get to know each other, even if they maybe afterwards don't go home together and don't become closest friends, but at least get to know each other. These are really important, and it seems to me that that is working here. But that does not, I don't want to gloss over existing inequalities. I'm sure they still exist. I'm sure there are still marginalized groups. So I think we need to be careful to not idealize what we see in these public and parochial spaces, and, you know, not idealize this happy being together and forget about existing inequalities and marginalizations.
Yeah, I think, yeah, when one is more jarring than the other, it does show up the unevenness of integration. I think we're almost the end of our session. Maybe I can invite both speakers to say some concluding remarks on the work that you're doing, and yeah.
You want to start? Thank you. I think the whole conference just shows that we need to continue the work we're doing, and continue to research how people live together across differences and despite disagreements and tensions, and how we can overcome tensions. And that, you know, the riots in the UK last summer showed once again how it doesn't take much for things to spark. And one of the things that I'm impressed with here in Singapore is that there seems to be such a strong awareness of the potential for tensions to arise, that there's a constant attempt to avoid these, whereas in the UK it feels more like, you know, something happens, there's a riot, and then there's a lot of initiatives to enhance social cohesion. So it's very reactive rather than proactive, and I think we should learn from this contrast between Singapore and the UK, and really proactively always attempt to create spaces where people talk to each other and have respect for each other while being aware of existing inequalities.
And probably I might also add the role of researchers and academics coming to the table, along with political leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, and NGO workers. So I think our contribution often is seen as, you know, highly scholarly and academic and too conceptual. But I think our insight can offer meaningful understanding of what's happening on the ground, and for policymakers and others to embrace those ideas and operationalize them. Last word from.
I think just one final thing to add is how we will understand social cohesion, integration, multiculturalism, convivial disintegration. I think, you know, I've been talking about kind of a rather different policy agenda, but I think it connects with ideas of multiculturalism in many ways. It's not disconnected from a lot of the discussions around that particular policy agenda. And I think one of my takeaway messages is kind of really drilling down into how researchers, how people talking about these different policy frameworks, how they really understand them, and what they mean by them, and what the end point of them is, and fully understanding that. I think we kind of gloss over it a lot, and we think we all know what we're talking about, but sometimes we don't.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the two presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you.